Hi, welcome to the Dr. Joobbi podcast. Today we're going to focus on Renaissance science and philosophy. But before we do that, let's take an overview of where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. And I'd like to outline our history, not just through an intellectual or scientific history, but also utilizing terms and concepts from art history and music history. We started by looking at the ancient Greek philosophers and thinkers. And then we moved on to ancient Rome, to the Roman period. In art, this is referred to as antiquity. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and before we referred to as antiquity. We then moved on to that middle period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, the rebirth, what we'll be looking at specifically today. And that middle period is called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Now, often in art and in music, we talk about High Middle Ages and Late Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages would be from 1001 to about 1300 CE, so the first 300 years of the millennium. And the Late Middle Ages would be considered to be from 1301 to 1500. And a lot of amazing things happen in between that in the Late Middle Ages from 1301 to 1500. One in particular was the invention of the mass medium printing press, which helped usher in the Renaissance and science. So we're going to look at the Renaissance today, 1450 to 1600. After that, we enter into in art and in music this reaction against Protestant Renaissance, a reaction actually ushered in by the Catholic Church, called the Baroque period. We then look at the classical period. The classical period would be the music of Haydn and Mozart and an emphasis on structure and logic, and a look back, a celebration of ancient Greek structure and architecture. This is known as the classical period. It's also the time of scientific revolution and of very logical philosophy and the Enlightenment. We have that for a good 75 years. And then individuals begin to look at what was neglected, and that would be the affective life, the emotional life, romantic life, a passionate, intuitive-driven thought. And that's what we call the Romantic 19th century, the 1800s, the music of Beethoven, a time of revolution, a time of passion, and very fiery politics in many parts of the Western world. We then move on to the modernism of the 20th century, a challenging of the emotionally centered romanticism. And this is really the birth of modern contemporary scientific psychology when we look at figures such as Hugo Münsterberg and William James. And then the period that we're in now, the postmodern, the 21st century. This is just a brief overview of where we've been, where we're going, but let's focus now on where we're at, the Renaissance, science and philosophy, from 1450 to 1600. Throughout the Middle Ages, we know that church dogma, specifically Catholic church dogma, the church was the Catholic Church. Catholic church dogma made fixed truths. There were exactly 7 heavenly bodies in the solar system. The earth is the center of the universe. Humans are created in God's image. And challenging any of these truths was an act of heresy and was punishable, but even by death or an imprisonment. Now, the Renaissance saw a shift. The Renaissance was a challenging of emphasis on dogma and religion and God, and a shift towards an interest in the human potential, in human being. Not unlike the cynics and the skeptics, Renaissance humanism saw a real suspicion on religious truths, and specifically on dogma. It wasn't necessarily a suspicion of God. It was a suspicion and a protest against church dogma, religious dogma, telling one how it is. We might even see the Renaissance and humanism as an emphasis on the individual rather than on the group. Now, this transition was not a fast one. It didn't happen quickly, and it also was not a very pleasant transition. And as we'll see, there were quite a few casualties along the way. But there were a few things that got the ball rolling towards a rebirth. One of those things was Aquinas' acceptance of reason and examining nature as a way of knowing God. Once the Catholic Church allowed for this kind of thinking, really was like the thin end of the wedge. There was also a look back into a more liberal way of exploring things as that we saw in ancient Greece. And this group of philosophers were known as humanists. This was a second contributing factor into this transition away from the Middle Ages and church dogma towards a Renaissance. There were also a number of technological advances at this time that really contributed to communication. And I believe that communication was a great proponent for change. In particular, as I'd mentioned, the Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. Suddenly, mass communication was born. In books and in pamphlets, word could be spread throughout a literate world. And there was also great exploration and trade at this time, commerce. We had Marco Polo in Asia and China. We had Christopher Columbus in the New World, and Ferdinand Magellan's expedition of circumnavigating the globe. This was a time when networks between continents, between lands, between cultures, between people were being formed. These networks were riding on the back of technology, whether that technology be the movable type printing press or sailing ships that could circumnavigate the globe, or any other number of technologies that allowed for transportation of information. With this exploration came contact with new cultures, new peoples, and great curiosity was born in this period of time. One of the great debates was whether or not the savages that had been encountered in what had now come to be called America, the savages, it was wondered if they had rational souls. It was later decided that the savages did have rational souls, as I'm sure they were relieved to find out. Now, with Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press, we no longer had to rely on scribes to hand copy texts. These scribes were typically monks who spent their time hand copying religious texts. This meant there wasn't a lot of time for thinking for oneself and writing one's own thoughts down. It was mostly a replication or duplication process of pre-existing texts. When Gutenberg's Bible was printed for the first time, people in mass could read the text for themselves, think about it, and actually begin writing their thoughts or interpretations on the text. Now, this really, quite possibly more than anything, fueled this Renaissance. This was a time when universities grew, when scholarship grew, when literacy grew. People began beyond just the special classes of the religious or the Catholic Church or the wealthy classes, the aristocracy. Others began to learn to read because there were books available. People began to think for themselves. I'd like to reemphasize that much of the technology that emerges in the Western cultures at this time had existed for hundreds of years in China. Woodblock printing was common in China, in China as a practice, as well as different technologies, compasses and navigational technologies. But there was not a lot of communication between the East and the West. But we focus on the development of these technologies in the West in this exploration. Now, this Renaissance interest in humanism. Let's discuss this word humanism. It does not refer to humaneness. It doesn't refer to humanitarianism. These are different concepts. Humanism refers to really a collection of thoughts, maybe even four things: individualism, personal religion, a great interest in the past, and anti-Aristotelianism. Now, we're going to unpack all four of these qualities, but the real questions of humanism, the real interest of humanism, was focused on the activity of human beings, of being human. How do we think? How do we behave and feel? What are we capable of? What are our potentials? A lot of what we'd even see as filtering into contemporary existentialism. The real focus here was on human being rather than on God. Now, this quality of individualism, this was a shift to the concern with human potential, human achievement. It's a very individual, what is possible in my life? What is my potential? This is a shift from the church or the aristocracy to an interest in the individual self, the potential of the self. Humanism also began to usher in what would become the Protestant Reformation. And this was really a reaction against Catholicism. But what we want to look at here in humanism is the idea of a personal religion, a personal relationship with God, not one that is mediated through priests and bishops and a pope. So elimination of a church religious hierarchy and a focus on an individual relationship with God. There was also an interest in the ancient Greeks and Romans, the philosophers, the poets, the writings, the artwork. But the Renaissance humanists wanted to explore those works for themselves, not as an interpretation through the church. So we see a great interest in the past. The humanists also became very skeptical and maybe even anti-Aristotelian. Aristotle had been celebrated by the Catholic Church as a way to endorse the church dogma, and Aristotle's philosophy itself had become dogmatic, that the writings were treated as scripture. The humanists were very skeptical about this, and if they were not critical of Aristotle in himself, they were critical of the church's use of Aristotle. And that really did form a spirit of anti-Aristotelianism, and also a close examination of Aristotle's writings to kind of parse or purge it from Catholic interpretation. In the next part of episode 4, we're going to be looking at 4 of these humanists. We're going to look at Francesco Petrarch. We're going to look at Giovanni Pico, Erasmus, and Martin Luther, who ushered in the Protestant Reformation. We'll also look at Michel de Montaigne, and this will bring us into the cusp of the classical period into Renaissance science. True. We love life, not because we're used to living, but because we are used to loving. There is always some madness in love, but there is also always some reason in madness. Francesco Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1374, and he's really known for his incredibly insightful poetry that speaks of a personal relationship with God, personal faith based on one's emotional feelings, a severe criticism of dogmatic Catholic traditions, and also a celebration of humanness, of creativity, of writing poetry, of singing songs, of creating art. Petrarch taught that God endowed us with the ability to create things to make the world a more beautiful and wonderful place. This was very different than the very intellectual, cerebral, scholastic, Aristotelian Christianity that preceded Petrarch. We do consider Petrarch to be the thinker, the poet, artist who ushers in the Renaissance. Another Italian, Giovanni Pico, who lived between 1463 and 1494, argued that humans had a unique place in the universe between angels and beastly animals. He said that we had a choice. We had a choice to act rationally and godlike and angelic, or to act like a beastly animal. Pico also argued that if we studied all of the philosophers and looked at all of their thinking and found what they had in common, that those common thoughts, those commonalities, those bridges between the different schools of thought would bring us to a truth. Another of the humanist thinkers was Desiderius Erasmus, who lived between 1466 and 1536 in Rotterdam. Erasmus was the illegitimate son of a priest, and this depressed him his entire life. Although he himself was ordained as a priest, he never liked the monastic life. He preferred traveling and studying and independence. And so he spent much of his life traveling around Europe, being a tutor for wealthy families. He was a very severe critic in dogmatic thinking, and was very much opposed to any type of fanatical or fan type thinking. He would often point out logical inconsistencies and problems in even the most classic thinkers' writings. As was the case in most of the humanist thinkers, Erasmus promoted a very simple and practical life, one that Jesus demonstrated rather than an extravagant life that many of the church fathers practiced. Erasmus had a real problem with fanaticism, being a fan of anything. He actually claimed that all war was a result of fanatical belief. Now, in 1512, Erasmus wrote a book called The Praise of Folly, and this became a bestseller. It was reprinted over 40 times, and it attacked everyone from the aristocracy to the papacy to philosophers, the Catholic Church. No one was spared. It's often said that Erasmus laid the reformist egg and Luther hatched it. This was just a comment of how Erasmus thought and his criticisms of Catholicism and the aristocracy and nobility led eventually to the Protestant Reformation. Listen to Erasmus on the Catholic Church. The Pope had far too much power. The preaching of indulgences had degenerated into shameless money-making. The veneration of saints had been corrupted to superstition. Church buildings were stuffed full of images. The music in services was more fitting for a wedding or a drinking party. The Mass was served by priests who lived godless lives and served it as a shoemaker practices his trade. Confession had become money-making and skirt-chasing. Priests and monks were shameless tyrants. It seems like the Catholic Church wanted to silence Erasmus, so they offered him a cardinalship to keep him to satisfy him and keep him quiet, but he refused, and eventually his writings were placed on the list of banned books for the Catholic Church. Martin Luther, born in 1483 and died in 1546, is the individual who kicked off the Reformation in 1517 when he nailed his 95 demands, known as the 95 Theses, onto the wall at the Castle Church in Wittenberg. These were 95 challenges to the church dogma and the church hierarchy. Luther, like many, were very upset by the increasing power of the Catholic Church, the view that somehow the church was the intermediary between the worshiper and God, and also the idea that people could pay a penance for their sins and be free of the sin. Luther was a bit authoritarian, maybe a bit more than a bit. I think all evidence points to the fact that Luther was very authoritarian in spirit, and he felt that people should not escape the consequences of their sin through the penance, through absolution, but if they've sinned, they should suffer the consequences, even if those consequences were eternal damnation. There was less ritual and more personal relationship and personal responsibility with God. There were also some other peculiarities about Protestantism that differentiate it from Catholicism. Listen to Luther regarding the marriage of priests and nuns. He argued that they lived in open liaisons with mistresses and fathered illegitimate children. He felt that there was no reason that a married man and a married woman could not do the work of God. He said the mother suckling the baby and washing diapers, the farmer at work, the couple having sex were as likely to be engaged in God-pleasing activities as was any nun engaged in prayer. It's interesting to note that in 1525, at the age of 42, Luther married a former nun and had 6 children. Point out, though, that if a man were interested in sex and the wife refused, that, and this is a quote, the husband might then turn to the household maid or someone else for sexual relations. And also more interesting advice from Luther comes when the woman is perhaps wed to an impotent man. She, with the consent of the man, who is not really her husband but only a dweller under the same roof with her, should have intercourse with another, for example, her husband's brother. They were to keep this marriage secret and ascribe any children to the so-called putative father. Such a woman would be in a saved state and would not be displeasing to God. So we see, even in early Protestantism, a rather peculiar relationship, maybe even preoccupation with sex, and maybe even what we might call in psychology mental acrobatics to justify some sexual behaviors that may be found questionable, certainly at that time. Now, even today, there's a debate between free will and determinism. And at the time, there was a debate between Erasmus and Luther. Erasmus was a defender of free will. He wrote a book in 1524 called The Free Will. And in 1525, Luther responded with a book called The Bondage of the Will. Luther was a determinist. He felt there was no free will, that God had determined everything that happens to us in our lives. Luther said God foresees, purposes, and does all things according to his immutable, eternal, infallible will. This thunderbolt throws free will flat and utterly dashes it to pieces. Why, then, do humans perform evil deeds? Luther answered, the human's will is like the beast of burden. If God rides it, it wills and goes whence God wills. If Satan rides it, it goes where Satan wills. Nor may it choose to which rider it will run, nor which it will seek, but the riders themselves contend who shall have and hold it. He continued, in all the things pertaining to salvation or damnation, man has no free will, but is captive, servant, and bondslave, either to the will of God or to the will of Satan. Still, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and present everywhere. Now, throughout the history of this debate between Erasmus and Luther, they remained kind to one another, but Luther was known to have an often disrespectful and dogmatic, even mean approach to with his opinion. He was convinced that his interpretation of Scripture was the only correct interpretation. And he would often comment that he would pray to God to enlighten Erasmus to the insights of the proper reading of the text. On a side note, Erasmus and Luther were both viciously anti-Semitic individuals. Finally, in 1521, Luther was excommunicated from the church. He founded Protestantism. And there were some characteristics about Protestantism that exist still today in Protestantism. It's a very austere and harsh and unforgiving sect of Christianity. It had eliminated any matriarch in the Christian faith. In Catholicism, there was a patriarch, which was God and Jesus, and a matriarch, which was the Virgin Mary. In Protestantism, it's a strict patriarchy. Very in-depth and interesting account of Luther and his influence on contemporary Protestantism and contemporary scientific thought can be found in Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom. And finally, we turn to Michel de Montaigne, our final humanist entering into the Renaissance, who lived between 1533 and 1592. It's interesting because Montaigne was a vehement questioner of the idea of indisputable knowledge. He, like Erasmus, argued against Catholicism, against Protestantism, about anything that claimed to have an all-encompassing knowable truth. Montaigne did not privilege humans over animals, and in fact, he claimed that it was this rationality of humans that got them into trouble. Montaigne did close readings of many philosophers and offered multiple interpretations to each author. This would resurface again in the 20th century with Jacques Derrida. He was also critical of science and said that it offered no permanent solutions, only temporary answers that contradicted the scientific answers themselves, changed too frequently to be seen as a reliable form of information. Now, some figures of the Renaissance that we aren't going into, individuals like Leonardo da Vinci and Niccolo Machiavelli and William Shakespeare, are really worth our time exploring, and we might do that in a future episode, but for right now, let us now turn to Ptolemy, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, the natural scientists of the Renaissance. Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi. This is episode 4, part 3 of the Renaissance. Today we're going to be looking at the beginning of Renaissance science. We're going to take a little overview of Ptolemy and then be introduced to Nikolai Copernicus. We're going to work through Copernicus and understand the Copernican revolution look into Kepler, into Galileo, into Sir Isaac Newton, and also to Francis Bacon. And we're going to conclude our discussion with René Descartes. This is Science of the Renaissance. It was in the 2nd century CE that Ptolemy put forth his view of a geocentric universe, that is, a universe where the Earth was at the center and the Sun and other planets orbited around the Earth. Now, it wasn't until the 1500s that Copernicus, in his Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, challenged this view, and it was overturned, ushering in a period of heliocentrism, or sun-centered universe. So we see a shift here from a geocentric worldview to a heliocentric worldview. But something that's very peculiar that we want to consider is that in 310 to 230 BCE, a theorist named Aristarchus of Samos put forth a theory that was identical to Copernicus's, a heliocentric theory that even stated that the Earth rotated around the Sun and that the Earth had its own axes that it rotated on. The question that comes to mind immediately is, why for 1700 years did this heliocentric theory not have any interest? Why was the geocentric theory celebrated? Well, there's 3 reasons for this. The first reason is that it seemed to fit in with what the senses experienced. The senses saw the sun moving around the Earth. It's what we experienced. It seemed as if the stars and the planets were rotating around the Earth. So the theory held true, the geocentric theory held true to our sensory experience. It also did allow for astronomical predictions. The system was very effective in predicting eclipses, in predicting the motions of the stars and location of planetary orbits. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it was in accordance with the Christian theology of the day. And this is where most people learned about things like the cosmology through the church. This is a time when much of philosophy had become dogmatic, had become the servant of theology. Now, word had gotten around by 1515 amongst the intellectuals that this canon of the Roman Catholic Church named Nicholas Copernicus had actually proposed a mathematical proof for a heliocentric world. And there were rumblings about this, but it wasn't until 1543 that the book was published, and that was the year that Copernicus died. And he actually dedicated the book, The Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, to Pope Paul III. He felt that the book was going to really help the Catholic Church to solve one of its biggest problems, which was an accurate calendar. So he was a devout Catholic, the dedications to the Pope, and the entire book is in a mathematical language, very esoteric mathematical language. No one really knew what it said, so it wasn't censored. Now, when the information in the book finally caught up with the Catholic Church, when the church fathers understood what was actually going on here, many questions were opened up. Were we favored by God and therefore placed in the center of the universe? If not, why? If the church was wrong about this, then what else could it be wrong about? Were there other solar systems that contained life? And if so, were we the favorites of God? There were a lot of very big, challenging questions to faith because of this model of a heliocentric universe. This was also another challenge to Aristotle. Aristotle had proposed a geocentric universe himself. Now, one individual who was very pleased with Copernicus's heliocentric view was Giordano Bruno, lived from 1548 to 1600. Bruno was a former Dominican priest who became interested in Hermetism, in Hermetic philosophy. This was the philosophy that saw life in everything, a sort of animism. And in Copernicus's heliocentric world, of course, the position of the sun was placed back at the center of spirituality, just like in ancient Egypt. And so Bruno embraced this and spoke more and more of this Hermetic philosophy, and the church just had had no use for this whatsoever. They were so irritated that the Inquisition in Venice in 1592, on May 26th, charged Bruno with 8 counts of heresy. He served 8 years in prison, and when he was released, they said he hadn't been reformed, and they burned him at the stake. He was burned at the stake for not believing in a church's doctrine. This kind of dogmatic brutality was not exclusive with the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestants were quite dogmatic themselves. John Calvin had ordered the anatomist Michael Cervetis, who lived from 1511 to 1553, to be burned at the stake because Cervetis had described the Holy Land as a barren wilderness, which it actually was, and contradicting the description of the land of milk and honey. So this was a time when any type of speaking against a religious dogma resulted in death, imprisonment, or death. Now, the interesting thing to realize is that Copernicus himself understood that Aristarchus had proposed the heliocentric theory 1700 years before Copernicus did, and Copernicus held off on publishing this theory simply because it didn't result in anything new scientifically. All of the planetary motions, the activities of the heavens, everything that was predictable using the Earth, the geocentric model, was identically predictable using the heliocentric model. Nothing was gained by switching to this. It was truly an ideological shift that was the danger here. This does come back to what we referred to earlier in Occam's razor, whereas the geocentric worldview was equally as accurate as the heliocentric worldview in planetary and astronomical predictions. The heliocentric theory did require fewer preliminary assumptions, and that was the rule of Occam's razor. What we also see here is an illustration of Kuhn's view of scientific revolutions. We had a worldview, a scientific paradigmatic worldview, the geocentric Ptolemaic worldview, and all of physics and science and astronomy was worked out around this within the framework of the Ptolemaic worldview. There was then a revolution that took place, and called the Copernican Revolution. And after the Copernican Revolution, the entire work of physics and astronomy shifted to a heliocentric worldview. All the mathematics were rewritten, all of the theories were adapted to a sun-centered universe. This was an example for Kuhn of a scientific revolution. So not only was the Catholic Church hostile and critical of the heliocentric view, but so was Martin Luther and the Protestants. Martin Luther condemned the heliocentric theory and said it would turn astronomy on its head, which of course it did in some ways. Luther said, "The fool will turn the whole science of astronomy upside down, but as Holy Writ declares, it was the sun and not the earth which Joshua commanded to stand still." Now, Johannes Kepler lived from 1571 to 1630, and he was born in Württemberg in modern Germany, and he was a believer, as was Pythagoras, in mathematical realities, not to trust the senses. The senses could mislead us, but math is where truth resided. Kepler was also known to be a mystic. He was, along with being an astronomer, was also an astrologer and would use the celestial bodies to make predictions and to understand people's personalities. Kepler was a bit of a mystic. He, in addition to practicing astronomy, practiced astrology. But when it comes to his contribution to contemporary science, we really focus on his insistence of backing up mathematical deductions with empirical observation. Now, something we see in both Kepler and Copernicus is the foreshadowing of what we describe as a clockwork universe, a mechanized, everything in its place, everything with its function universe. This was one of the assumptions of early Renaissance science. And another individual who was a strong adherent to this idea of a clockwork universe was Galileo Galilei, who at 25 years of age was appointed professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa in Italy. Listen to his thoughts on mathematical terms. Philosophy is written in that great book which ever lies before our eyes, I mean the universe. But we cannot understand it if we do not first learn the language and grasp the symbols in which it was written. This book is written in the mathematical language, and the symbols are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without whose help it is impossible to comprehend a single word of it, without which one wanders in vain through a dark labyrinth. Now this really sounds like Pythagoras and Plato, but it's Galileo. Now Galileo was really on a mathematical and an empirically observable and empirical mission. First, he disputed Aristotle's claim that objects that were heavier fell faster, and he did a series of experiments that are now famous to show that objects fall at the same rate in a vacuum. And Aristotle had contended that it was in the given nature of an object to fall towards the earth more quickly than some other object. Galileo also wrote a book that in 1609 just demolished every argument against the heliocentric worldview that existed. He investigated sunspots and mountains on the moon, and he also discovered that the Milky Way was made up of many more stars than what we could see with the naked eye. And of course, he did this with the aid of his telescope. Many of his academic and intellectual friends refused to actually look through his telescope. Listen to an excerpt from a letter that Galileo had written to his friend Kepler. "Oh, my dear Kepler, how I wish that we could have one hearty laugh together. Here at Padua is the principal professor of philosophy, whom I have repeatedly and urgently requested to look at the moon and planets through my glass, which he perniciously refuses to do. Why are you not here? What shouts of laughter we should have at this glorious folly, and to hear the professor of philosophy at Pisa laboring before the Grand Duke with logical arguments, as if with magical incantations to charm the new planets out of the sky." In Thomas Kuhn's 1963 text, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he quotes another very interesting reaction to Galileo's request for a colleague to look into his telescope. The colleague asserted if God meant man to use such a contrivance in acquiring knowledge, he would have endowed men with telescopic eyes. And we see here the how Galileo was met against from his intellectual colleagues regarding his technology and his findings. So the skepticism was not merely against what Galileo was saying, it was the technology that he was using to find evidence for it. Now, Galileo believed that laws were actual things that governed how the universe functioned, and that once one discovered the law, then the case was closed, and we could move on to discovering the next law. This, of course, is much different than the way we understand theoretical science today. He also made a distinction between objective and subjective reality. That is, reality as it truly is and reality as we experience it. He said that objective reality consists of what is called primary qualities. These are things that are observable, measurable, precise, mathematical, and descriptive and beyond dispute. These aspects of the primary qualities would include quantity, shape, size, position, and whether or not the object is at motion or at rest. Galileo also described that there were subjective or secondary qualities of an object, and these were things that could not be measured or observed by more than one person. They were unique to an individual's psychological makeup. These secondary qualities included things like the color, sound, temperature, smell, and taste. Primary qualities would be reality. Secondary qualities would be nominal. In other words, merely things described by names. In Galileo's own words, hence I think that these tastes, odors, colors, etc., on the side of the object in which they seem to exist, are nothing else than mere names, but hold their residence solely in the sensitive body, so that if the animal were removed, every such quality would be abolished and annihilated. Nevertheless, as soon as we have imposed names on them, we induce ourselves to believe that they also exist just as truly and really as the primary qualities. So what Galileo is saying here is that the primary qualities and secondary qualities both seem equally as real to the individual. But in actuality, only primary qualities are real. Secondary qualities are relative to the individual who is experiencing. Now, because the secondary qualities were largely psychological and the primary qualities were the domain of mathematics and science, Galileo felt that the mind or consciousness or these secondary qualities could never be studied by science. We'll find that Sigmund Freud was aware of Galileo's criticism and that Freud's endeavor into developing what he called the new science, which came to be called psychoanalysis, but he called it the new science, was a logical and structured approach to studying the mind with its own special tools and unique methods for doing so. Finally, at 70 years of age, Galileo was blind. He had rheumatism. His health was failing, and the Inquisition brought him to trial and found him guilty of heresy, and he was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. He continued to write in secret, but he was made by the Inquisition to completely reject all of his scientific findings and to claim that he was in error. And finally, on January 9th, 1642, Galileo passed away. So this opens the door. Next, we move to Sir Isaac Newton in our investigation of Renaissance science in the history of psychology. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Dr. Matthew Giobbi. We're now in episode 4 of the history of psychology. We're looking at Renaissance science and Renaissance philosophy. This is actually part 4 of episode 4. Where we're at right now is are opening into three thinkers that really lead into everything that modernism and the Enlightenment brings us. And those three thinkers are Sir Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes. So let's unpack these three thinkers now and take a look at Renaissance science. These three thinkers, that's Sir Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and René Descartes, each of them contributed something unique to the project of empirical science, of modernism, and our contemporary science. Those three things are as follows. When you think of Isaac Newton, we want to consider universal laws. Newton really reinforced in us the idea that science could uncover, discover laws that were universal, that were true in all places and all times. An idea that would come to dominate physics in the way it was done until the Einsteinian revolution in 1905. When we think of the second figure, that is Francis Bacon, Bacon's big contribution to modernism and to scientific thought is the inductive method. And finally, René Descartes. From Descartes, we have mathematics and deduction. Let us turn now to the first of these three figures, Isaac Newton. Like Galileo before him, Newton thought of the universe to be a giant machine that was created by God. Born in 1642, Newton was raised mostly by his grandparents, by his grandmother, and he was eventually taken back into his home by his mother. His father had passed away, and it was recognized that he was quite precocious. And at 19, he was accepted and entered into Trinity College in Cambridge. And 4 years later, he graduated. In 1687, he wrote a masterpiece, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, and he was immediately recognized as a genius. Now, Newton was a devout believer in God, but his belief system was a little different, something that would be catching on after Newton, and that's called deism. And this was the idea that the universe was all structured and put together like a mechanically designed mechanism that God put into motion and then stepped back and allowed it to do its thing. And it wouldn't be long until the very same opinion would be applied to human beings. Human beings were mechanical, biomechanical automatons that once put in motion just did their thing. Newton and those thinking as deists felt that things like prayer and intervention was fruitless, that yes, God did create the universe, but now it was governed by the universal laws that were put in place in the beginning. Speaking on the matter of belief, it's also important to keep in mind that Newton's only the smallest amount of his work was done in mathematics and science. Much of Newton's research was in numerology and in alchemy, very fascinating endeavors that he kept very secretive about. He actually attempted to calculate through decoding the Bible, attempted to calculate the exact date of the apocalypse, of the end of the world. For Newton, the law was the law. Any inconsistency that might occur in the laws of nature would not be an inconsistency in the law of nature. It would be a problem with an individual's perceptual system. And Newton was also very interested in making the distinction between classification and explanation. Classifying something, in other words, naming it, giving it a Latin genus and species name, was not explaining it or understanding it. If, for instance, we go into the woods and we find a certain mushroom and we look at its characteristics and we match it to a sketch and understand that it's a certain Agaricus bisporus, once we say, I know the mushroom, it's an agaricus bisporus, we don't really know this mushroom. We haven't explained the mushroom. We simply have the label that's been designated to it. Newton pointed out that it's an error to think that we know more than we know just because we name something. But through Newton's mathematical models, describing laws and the lawful activity of the material substances that were existing here on Earth, and being able to use these mathematical calculations and these models to describe and predict what would happen in certain events, gave science a great deal of legitimacy, a great deal of credence to the power of science. And that science itself started to become like a religion. Some people at this time started to abandon religion and to look to science in its place, and would criticize religious people for being dogmatic or myopic, much of which happens yet to this day. But what we saw was science becoming almost like a religion itself. Today we call this scientism. Scientism is when people, scientists approach science in such a dogmatic way that it excludes any other explanation as illegitimate. So this is the concept of scientism. And we start to see that this almost fanatical belief in science begins to occur with the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton. Listen to this passage from MacLeod's 1975 text. For centuries, the Church had been impressing on man the limitations of his own wisdom. The mind of God is unfathomable. God works in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. Man must be content with partial understanding. The rest he must simply believe. For Galileo or a Newton, such a restriction of human curiosity was unacceptable. The scientist was willing to concede that some things may be ultimately unintelligible except on the basis of faith. But as he stubbornly continued to observe, measure, and experiment, he discovered that more and more of the puzzles of nature were becoming clear. He was actually explaining in natural terms phenomena that had hitherto been unintelligible. Small wonder, then, that the new science began to generate a faith that ultimately science would displace theology. There is little evidence that in the 16th and 17th centuries such a faith was more than a dim hope. Nevertheless, the seeds had been sown. Scientists were uncovering more and more of the secrets of nature, and more explanations were now being given without the benefit of clergy. All the accomplishments of Newton, from developing calculus to establishing laws of gravity and mechanical Newtonian physics, his most proud accomplishment in his lifetime, he said, was his lifelong celibacy. Let's turn now to Francis Bacon, who further developed the idea of scientific laws. And it's interesting that many of these early thinkers of science and developers of the scientific laws were in fact trained as lawyers, and Francis Bacon was trained as a lawyer. Born in 1561, he died in 1626, and he had a career as a government man, as a diplomat to France, and he published his most famous work, the Novum Organum, in 1620, and just after that publication, he was actually impeached from his parliamentary position for accepting bribes. He served a very brief prison sentence for accepting these bribes, and at 60 years of age, he was no longer in office, had no job, so he devoted himself to studying science. Now, Galileo had proposed a deductive method. This was the idea that we come up with a general principle, and then we see how examples that occur in nature fit into that general principle. But Bacon was interested in doing science differently. Bacon was interested in induction. And according to Bacon, science should not have theories or hypotheses or mathematics. No deduction should be involved in this. We shouldn't be deducing anything. We should simply be collecting facts and organizing them. And this is the inductive method. The inductive method is starting with particular instances and collecting those particular instances into a bigger whole. Deduction is starting with a theory and then examining occurrences, individual occurrences from the framework of that theory. Bacon was certainly a realist, an empiricist. He had little use for rationalism or the thinking about things. He felt that the mind could lead people astray in their conclusions. For Bacon, just like for Plato, words and pictures were removed from the actual thing itself. And he said we should be very skeptical of mistaking the name of something for the thing itself. And although Bacon was emphatically an empiricist, he did allow room for thinking about the observations. In fact, toward the end of his life, he actually talked about a middle way. He described the empiricists to be like ants who just collected things. The rationalists, he felt, were like spiders who wove webs. And he said a real thinker should be like a bee that flies around and does gather things and then makes honey. Bacon had two cardinal rules for science. The first one, to lay aside received opinions and notions, and the other, to restrain the mind for a time from the highest generalizations. This is very interesting because what we're starting to see here are rules for thinking, not mathematical rules, but rules that were set forth to get to better thinking. In fact, Bacon set out to develop four basic rules for thinking, four fallacies, we could call them. He called them idols, the four idols of thinking, four ways that we go astray in our thinking. Let's look at those four idols. They are the idols of the cave, the idols of the tribe, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theater. Let's look at each of them individually. Firstly, idols of the cave. The cave is the environment we grow up in. These are biases. These are things that we each form in our intellectual endowment, our experiences, our education, our feelings, any of the things that are unique to us that are due to our upbringing and our surroundings that affect how we view events in the world. Only humans can experience the world the way humans experience the world. This is called the idols of the tribe. We have to be aware of our bias, our human bias. Later, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein would describe the same thing as a form of life. He would say, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. And that was because they would be speaking from the lion's experience, which is just completely different than a human experience. Idols of the marketplace. The marketplace is the commodity of knowledge. This is the bias of how we feel about words and how they're used. When we have words connected to things as descriptive words, they become pregnant with emotion, with prejudices. Imagine a very common social psychology experiment today that shows the idols of the marketplace. When conservatives are presented an idea and they're told that it is from their conservative cohort, they're more likely to accept that idea than if they're told that it was developed by a liberal cohort. And the same is true for the opposing. The point here is that we tend to put value in words more than ideas. And for Bacon, this was a bias. And finally, Bacon warns us to be aware of the bias of the idols of the theater. And this is having some kind of allegiance to a perspective and accepting certain ideas and not accepting other ideas simply because they're not in agreement or in agreement with our team, our school of thought. So an idea that might be prominent in psychoanalysis could be rejected by an individual who's a behaviorist simply because it's not part of their team. We see this over and over again, especially in psychology. In our final part of episode 4, we'll be looking specifically at René Descartes. So stay tuned for the Renaissance science in the history of psychology.